There is a moment that almost every English learner knows. You are in a conversation. Someone asks you a question. You know the answer. You have the thought sitting right there in your head, clear and ready. You open your mouth, and then something happens. Something invisible steps in. A voice inside your head says, "Wait, is that the right word? Is that the correct grammar? Does that sentence sound natural? Should I say it differently?" And by the time you have finished checking and correcting and deciding, the moment is gone. The conversation has moved forward. Other people have already spoken. And you are still standing there, frozen, feeling confused about what just happened. You felt stupid. You felt slow. You told yourself that your English is just not good enough. You told yourself that you need to study more. You told yourself that one day, when your English is better, this will stop happening. But here is the thing. This is not about your English level. This is not about how many words you know. This is not about how much grammar you have studied. This is not even really about English at all. This is about one single habit that is running quietly in the background every single time you try to speak. And until you understand this habit, until you see exactly what it is doing to you and why it is there, no amount of studying is going to fix this problem. You can memorize 1,000 new vocabulary words and it will not help. You can study grammar every single day and it will not help. Because the problem is not what you know. The problem is what you are doing with what you know in real time while you are trying to speak. And what you are doing is this. You are editing yourself while you speak. You are running a correction program in your head at the exact same moment you are trying to produce language. You are writing the sentence, checking the sentence, correcting the sentence, and trying to say the sentence all at the same time. And the human brain simply cannot do this well. It was not designed for this. No brain was. Not yours, not mine, not the brain of the most fluent English speaker in the world. This is the real reason you struggle. Not your vocabulary, not your grammar, not your accent, not your confidence in some vague motivational sense. The editing habit. That is it. That is the thing. And in this video, we are going to go deep into this. We are going to look at exactly what editing while speaking means. We are going to look at where this habit comes from, because it did not just appear out of nowhere. Something taught it to you. And when you understand what that was, a lot of things will suddenly make sense. We are going to look at exactly how this habit damages your fluency in very concrete and specific ways. We are going to look at what fluent speakers actually do instead, because this is not just about stopping a bad habit, it is about replacing it with a different process. And then we are going to look at how you can actually change this, not in theory, but in practice, with real things you can do starting today. This is going to take time. This is a long video, and I want you to stay with it, because the ideas build on each other. By the end, you will understand your speaking problem in a completely different way. And that different understanding is the beginning of real change. So let us start from the very beginning. What editing while speaking actually means. When I say you are editing while you speak, I want to make sure we are talking about the exact same thing, because the word editing can sound a little abstract. So let me describe it in very concrete terms. Imagine you are going to say this simple sentence. You want to say, "Yesterday, I went to the market and I bought some vegetables." Now watch what happens inside your head when you try to say this in English. You start forming the sentence, and immediately a checking process begins. Yesterday. Okay, so this is past tense, right? I need past tense here. Went is went, correct? Or is it go? No, go is present. Went is past. Okay, went. To the market, do I say to the market or at the market? In my language, we say at. But is it at or to in English? I think it is to. Okay, to the market. And I bought, wait. Should that be I bought or I have bought? Which tense is this? Past simple or present perfect? And some vegetables. Is it some or any? I always confuse these two. Is it some or any in positive sentences? By the time you have finished this internal conversation, 3 or 4 seconds have passed. You have said nothing. Or you have said the first 3 words and then stopped. Or you rushed through the sentence so fast, trying to get to the end before you could second guess yourself, that it came out broken and unclear. This is editing while speaking. It is the process of checking, questioning, correcting, and redeciding every word, every grammar structure, every preposition, every article as you are trying to produce language in real time. And you might think, well, is that not what I am supposed to do? Is that not how careful speakers speak? Should I not be paying attention to my grammar? No, absolutely not. Not while you are speaking. And here is why. When you are speaking, when language is coming out of your mouth in real time, you are doing something that requires extremely fast processing. Human conversation moves at a speed of roughly 120 to 180 words per minute. Even at the slower end of that range, you are producing 2 words every single second. 2 complete words, with all their sounds and meanings and grammatical relationships, every second. That is extremely fast. And to do this, your brain needs to work in a very specific way. It needs to pull from automatic processes, things that you have practiced so much that they happen without you consciously thinking about them. Things that have become, in the language of psychology, automatic and not controlled. Editing is a controlled process. It is slow, conscious, deliberate, and it requires your attention. Speaking fluently is an automatic process. It is fast, unconscious, and it runs on its own when you let it. When you edit while you speak, you are trying to run a slow process inside a fast process. You are trying to do both at the same time, and they are fundamentally incompatible. One of them always loses. And in most cases, both of them lose. The editing is not good enough because you are rushing it, and the speaking is not fluent because it keeps getting interrupted. This is the core of the problem. Not vocabulary, not grammar. The collision between 2 incompatible processes happening at the same time. And the most painful part of this is that the editing is not even helping you. That is the cruelest part. You think the editing is making your English better, more correct, more accurate. But in most cases, it is not. The sentences you reject in your head are often perfectly fine. The corrections you make are often unnecessary. The grammar rules you are trying to apply in real time are rules you learned from a textbook in isolation, with time to think, and they do not transfer cleanly to live conversation. Especially when you are nervous and your brain is already working hard just to manage the social situation you are in. The editing is not helping you sound better. It is making you sound worse. It is making you slower, more hesitant, more broken, more anxious, and then the anxiety itself makes the editing worse. And the worse editing makes you more anxious, around and around, faster and faster, until speaking English feels like trying to swim through thick sand. Understanding this is the first step. Not motivational understanding. I mean real, deep, technical understanding. Because once you understand it clearly, you will start to see it happening in real time. And seeing it is the beginning of changing it. Where this habit came from. Now we need to ask the obvious next question. If editing while speaking is so damaging, why do you do it? Why did this habit develop? Where did it come from? This is important because habits do not appear for no reason. Every habit you have developed was a response to something in your environment, something in your experience, something that was taught to you or that you taught yourself. And the editing habit is no different. It has a very clear origin. And when you understand where it came from, 2 things happen. First, you stop blaming yourself for having it. And second, you start to understand exactly what needs to change and why. So, where did the editing habit come from? It came from school. I do not mean this as a criticism of schools or teachers. I am simply describing what happened, mechanically, in terms of how you were taught and what that teaching trained your brain to do. When you learned English in school, or in a language class, or through any formal educational method, you were almost certainly taught in a very specific way. You were taught to understand rules. You were shown grammar structures. You were given exercises. You wrote sentences. You did gap-filled tasks. You translated texts. You took tests. And in all of these activities, there was one thing that was always present: time. You had time to think. You had time to apply the rule. You had time to check your answer. You had time to go back and correct yourself. This is actually a very reasonable way to teach language. When you are learning a new system, whether it is grammar or mathematics or music theory, you need to learn the rules first at a slow speed, with time to think. You need to consolidate the knowledge before you try to apply it quickly. But here is where the problem starts. When you did all of those exercises, all of those tests, all of those grammar tasks, your brain was learning two things at the same time. It was learning the grammar rules, and it was also learning a behavior pattern. The behavior pattern was this: when you produce English, check it before you deliver it. When you form a sentence, verify it. When you choose a word, make sure it is correct. This checking behavior was not just a strategy you used in exams. It became a habit. It became the automatic thing your brain does whenever English is required. In an exam, this habit is useful. In a test, you have time to check. In a worksheet, you have time to verify. But in a real conversation, you do not have time. The conversation is moving. Other people are waiting. And so, the habit that served you in a controlled learning environment is now working against you in an uncontrolled social environment. And there is more. School not only taught you the habit of checking, it also taught you that making mistakes is bad. Every time you made an error in a test, you lost points. Every time you produced an incorrect sentence, the teacher marked it wrong. Every time you made a grammar mistake, it was highlighted in red pen. Over years and years and years of this, your brain built a very strong association. Making a mistake in English is a failure. It is something to avoid. It is something to be ashamed of. So now, when you speak, you are not just checking because you learned to check. You are also checking because you are afraid. You are afraid of making a mistake. You are afraid of sounding wrong. You are afraid of what people will think. And this fear, this deep, trained, almost automatic fear of making an error, is the fuel that keeps the editing machine running, even when you know, on an intellectual level, that it is hurting you. You know the editing is slowing you down. You can feel it, but you cannot just switch it off because it is connected to something much deeper than a simple habit. It is connected to a belief about what it means to make a mistake. And beliefs are harder to change than behaviors. You have to go deeper. There is also another source of the editing habit that does not get talked about enough: translation. Many English learners, especially those who learned English as a foreign language, meaning they grew up speaking a completely different language, at home, have a deep habit of thinking in their first language and then translating to English. And translation is, at its core, a form of editing. When you translate, you are taking a thought that already exists in one form and converting it into a different form. You are comparing the original to the translation. You are checking whether the translation captures the meaning correctly. This is an editing process. And for many learners, this translation and check cycle has become so automatic, so deeply embedded in their speaking process, that they do not even notice it is happening. They think they are simply speaking English, but what they are actually doing is thinking in their native language, translating to English, checking the translation, deciding whether it sounds right, correcting it if it does not, and then finally producing it. All of this in the space of a second or two. This is exhausting. It is cognitively expensive, And it is slow, much too slow, for natural conversation. So the editing habit has three roots: the checking behavior, trained by formal education; the fear of mistakes, trained by error correction; and the translation habit built from years of processing English through your first language. These three things combine to create what I am calling the internal editor, and we need to understand this internal editor in much greater detail because it is the main character in this story. The internal editor. I want you to think of your internal editor as a character, not a metaphor, not an abstract concept, but a real character with a personality and a job description and a history. Your internal editor is the voice inside your head that checks your English as you speak. It is the part of your brain that is constantly running a background assessment. Is this right? Is this natural? Is this correct? Did I say that well? Would a native speaker say it this way? Am I making sense? This editor is always there when you speak English. It never takes a break. It never goes quiet. It sits in the back of your head with a red pen, and it reviews every sentence you try to produce in real time, before and sometimes even after you say it out loud. Now, here is something important I want you to understand about your internal editor. It was not born bad. It did not come into your life to hurt you. It came into your life because it thought it was helping you. And in a very narrow context, the context of written English, of academic English, of prepared and edited English, it does help. When you are writing an email and you have time to review it before you send it, your internal editor is doing a useful job. When you are writing an essay and you want to go back and improve your grammar and vocabulary, your internal editor is valuable. When you are preparing a speech and you have time to rehearse and refine, your internal editor is an asset. But the editor does not know when to stop. It does not know the difference between a context where checking is useful and a context where checking is harmful. It has one mode: check everything. And so it applies this mode to every English situation you are in, including live conversation, including casual talk, including situations where the most important thing is not correctness, but connection, not accuracy, but flow. And this is the tragedy of the internal editor. It is not your enemy. It is an old friend who is working very hard to protect you, but it does not understand that what it is doing is actually hurting you. It is like a person who loves you so much that they hold on too tight. Their intention is good, but the effect is damage. Now, your internal editor is very specific about what it focuses on. It does not check everything equally. It tends to focus on a few particular areas, and these areas are where most of the friction and freezing happens. Let me describe each of these areas, because recognizing them is how you start to interrupt the pattern. The first area is grammar. Your editor is constantly checking verb tenses: present simple or present continuous, past simple or present perfect, active or passive. This is the most common source of freezing. Grammar checking in real time is extremely expensive for the brain because English grammar is complex, irregular, and context dependent. There is no single rule that tells you which tense to use in every situation. Context matters. Meaning matters. Relationship between events matters. And deciding all of this while also trying to speak is simply too much. The second area is vocabulary. Your editor is always looking for the perfect word, not just a word that communicates the meaning, the perfect word, the most precise, most natural, most native-sounding word. And because there is almost always more than one way to say something in English, and because you often know multiple words for the same concept, the editor gets stuck choosing between them. Do I say big or large? Do I say problem or issue? Do I say angry or upset? Do I say find out or discover? Each of these choices triggers a small debate in your head, and that debate takes time. And time is exactly what you do not have in a live conversation. The third area is pronunciation. Some learners have an editor that is constantly checking their pronunciation. Am I saying this word correctly? Is my accent too strong? Did I pronounce that sound right? This is particularly common for learners who speak languages that sound very different from English learners who struggle with specific sounds that do not exist in their native language, or whose prosody and rhythm feel different from English. The pronunciation editor is one of the most socially painful because it is connected to feelings about how you are perceived, how intelligent you sound, how foreign you seem. The fourth area is naturalness. This is the most subtle form of editing and in many ways the most damaging. It is when your editor is not checking specific rules, but is simply asking, does this sound natural? Does this sound like something a real English speaker would say? And the problem is that this question is almost impossible to answer in real time, especially if you have not spent a lot of time immersed in natural English conversation. You do not have a clear internal model of what natural sounds like, so the editor keeps asking the question without ever getting a satisfying answer. And the result is constant uncertainty, constant hesitation, constant revision. These four areas, grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation, and naturalness, are where your internal editor focuses. And every time it focuses on one of them, it creates a small interruption in your speech, a tiny pause, a subtle hesitation, a slight change of direction, mid-sentence. End quote, 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 end quote. And these interruptions add up to what we experience as broken, non-fluent, difficult English. How editing destroys your flow. Now let us talk about flow, because flow is really the heart of what we are trying to understand here. Flow in speaking is what happens when language comes out of you continuously, without major interruptions, without long pauses, without obvious stops and starts. When someone speaks with flow, the words connect smoothly to each other. The rhythm is consistent. The meaning builds sentence by sentence in a natural and logical way. Flow does not mean speaking fast. You can speak slowly and still have flow. Flow is about continuity, not speed. When you edit while you speak, you break your flow. And you break it in several different and damaging ways. The most obvious way is through pausing. When your internal editor steps in to check something, your speech stops. You go quiet. The other person waits. And this pause is not a normal, natural pause, the kind of pause that every speaker uses to breathe or to gather thoughts. It is a frozen pause, a stuck pause, a pause that communicates to the other person that you are struggling, that something is not working right in your language processing. These pauses are one of the most visible signs of the editing habit, and they are one of the things that makes people feel self-conscious about their English. The second way editing breaks flow is through restarting. This is when you begin a sentence, realize, partway through, that something feels wrong, stop, and start the sentence again. Yesterday, I went to. No, wait, I have gone. I went. This happens to almost every learner at some point. And again, it is not a sign that you do not know the grammar. It is a sign that you are trying to apply the grammar in real time, under pressure, while also managing everything else a conversation requires. The grammar knowledge is there, but the editing habit is interfering with your ability to access it smoothly. The third way editing breaks flow is through filler overuse. When your editor is working hard and creating delays, your mouth still needs to do something. You cannot just go completely silent for 3 seconds in the middle of a sentence that is socially awkward, and it signals to others that you are in serious difficulty. So, instead, you fill the silence with filler words and sounds. Like, well. So, these fillers are not bad. In small amounts, every speaker uses them. But when you are editing heavily, you use them excessively. You stack them. It is this thing where it is like a well, basically. And the excessive filler usage is not neutral. It makes you harder to understand. It makes you seem uncertain and unconfident. And it draws attention to the fact that something is going wrong in your processing. The fourth way editing breaks flow is more subtle but very damaging. It is through meaning fragmentation. When you are editing heavily, you tend to produce language in very small pieces. You say a little bit, stop, check, say a little more, stop, check. And because each piece is produced in isolation, disconnected from the next piece, the overall meaning becomes harder to follow. Sentences become sentence fragments. Arguments lose their structure. Stories lose their arc. The listener starts to work harder to understand you, not because your words are wrong, but because the coherence, the logical flow of ideas has been chopped up by all the internal interruptions. And there is a fifth way, which is perhaps the most insidious. Editing, while you speak, uses up your mental energy. Your brain has a limited amount of working memory, the mental space where you hold and process information in real time. When you are editing, you are filling a large portion of that working memory with the editing process itself, checking grammar, evaluating vocabulary, monitoring pronunciation, assessing naturalness. All of this is running in that limited mental space. And that means there is less space left for everything else you need to do in a conversation. There is less space to listen carefully to what the other person is saying. Less space to think about what you want to say next. Less space to notice the emotional tone of the conversation. Less space to read social cues and respond appropriately. You become so focused on the linguistic monitoring on the editing that you lose track of the actual conversation itself. This is why many learners say that speaking English is exhausting. It is not just because English is difficult. It is because they are running too many processes at the same time. And the editing process is the most expensive one. Remove the editing, and the conversation suddenly becomes much more manageable, much less tiring, much more natural. Now, I want to be very clear about something. When I say remove the editing, I do not mean speak without any attention to language quality. I do not mean say whatever comes out and never care about grammar or accuracy. That is not the goal. The goal is to move the editing to a different time after the fact, not during. To be reflective about your language after conversations, in study time, when you have space and quiet and time to think. But during the conversation itself, the goal is to let language flow, to trust your automatic processes, to get out of your own way. And to do this, you need to understand what happens when language flows naturally, what the fluent process actually looks like. Because it is very different from what you might imagine, what fluent speakers actually do. One of the biggest misconceptions that English learners have is about what is happening inside the head of a fluent English speaker when they speak. Most learners imagine that fluent speakers are doing what learners do, just faster. They imagine that a native speaker is also choosing words carefully, checking grammar, monitoring pronunciation, but that they do it all so quickly that it looks effortless, like a very fast editor rather than a slow one. This is completely wrong, and understanding why it is wrong is genuinely life-changing for language learners. Fluent speakers, whether native speakers or highly proficient non-native speakers, are not doing fast editing. They are not editing at all, in the sense we have been talking about. What they are doing is something completely different. They are producing language through automatic processes that run below the level of conscious attention. Let me explain what this means. When a fluent speaker wants to express an idea, their brain does not first construct a sentence in its component parts, subject, verb, object, tense, etc., and then check each part against a rule system. Instead, the brain activates a kind of holistic pattern. It recalls not individual words and rules, but chunks, whole phrases, whole structures that have been used so many times that they have been stored as single units. Things like, I was wondering if you could, or it depends on what you mean by, or the thing is, or as far as I know. These are not constructed word by word. They are retrieved as complete units, the way you retrieve a phone number you have memorized, not digit by digit, but as a whole sequence. And this is the key insight. Fluent language is not constructed. It is retrieved. It is not built from rules. It is pulled from a library of patterns. Of course, fluent speakers can construct novel sentences too, things they have never said before. But even this construction is not rule-based in the way textbook grammar is rule-based. It is more like an intuitive feel for what sounds right, a sense that has been built up through enormous amounts of exposure and use, not through conscious rule application. And here is what this means for you. You cannot become fluent by knowing more grammar rules. You can know every single grammar rule in every English grammar book ever written and still be non-fluent, because fluency is not about knowing rules. Fluency is about having a library of patterns so large and so deeply internalized that language production becomes automatic. And you build that library not by studying, but by using, by speaking, by reading, by listening, by encountering language in context over and over until the patterns become second nature. But, and this is very important, you can only build that library if you are actually letting the language flow out of you in practice. If every time you practice speaking, you are interrupting the process to edit and check and correct, you are not actually giving your brain the opportunity to build those automatic patterns. You are keeping language production in the slow, conscious, deliberate zone instead of moving it into the fast, automatic zone where fluency lives. This is why editing while speaking not only makes you sound less fluent right now, it also slows down the process of becoming more fluent over time. It is double damage. It hurts your performance in the present, and it slows your development for the future. Fluent speakers make mistakes too. Real mistakes, not just small slips, but actual errors. They say things that are not perfectly grammatical. They use words slightly incorrectly. They sometimes construct sentences that are a little awkward. But because they are not monitoring every word in real time, these errors pass through, and the conversation continues. And very often, the listener does not even notice, because the flow and the confidence and the natural rhythm of the speech communicates competence even when individual elements are imperfect. This is one of the most important things to understand about communication. Fluency and accuracy are not the same thing. Accuracy is about producing language that follows the rules of the language system. Fluency is about producing language that flows naturally, that is easy to follow, that maintains the rhythm and continuity of human conversation. And in real-world communication, fluency matters more than accuracy. People are much more forgiving of grammatical imperfections in a speaker who is fluent and confident than they are of perfectly grammatical language that is delivered haltingly and with great difficulty. You can communicate extremely effectively in English with occasional grammatical errors as long as your flow is good. You cannot communicate effectively in English with perfect grammar and no flow. Because communication requires rhythm, requires continuity, requires the listener to be able to follow your meaning without working too hard, and editing destroys all of those things. So what fluent speakers actually do is, they trust their automatic language system. They let it run. They do not step in with the conscious editor while they are speaking. They stay present in the conversation, listening, thinking, responding, and they let the language production system do its job without interference. And the good news, the genuinely good news, is that your brain works the same way. You have the same brain architecture as a fluent speaker. You have automatic processing systems. You have a library of patterns, even if it is smaller than you would like. And you can train those systems to take over from the editor. But to do that, you need to understand more about what is happening at the brain level when you speak. How your brain processes language. Let us spend some time on the brain. Not in a deep neuroscience lecture. I want to keep this practical and useful. But you need to understand the basic way your brain handles language, because it directly explains why editing while speaking is so destructive and why training automatic responses is so powerful. Your brain has two broad modes of operation when it comes to complex tasks. The first mode is slow, careful, deliberate, and conscious. Psychologists call this system two thinking or controlled processing. This is the mode you use when you are doing something difficult for the first time or something that requires careful attention. It is slow because it can only handle one thing at a time. It requires your full attention. It feels effortful, and it uses a lot of mental energy. The second mode is fast, automatic, unconscious, and effortless. This is called System 1 thinking or automatic processing. This is the mode you use when you do something you have done so many times that it has become habitual. When you drive a car on a familiar road. When you type on a keyboard without looking at the keys. When you walk downstairs, you are not consciously controlling each step. The process runs automatically, and you can do other things at the same time. Now, when you first learn a new skill, you operate almost entirely in System 2, the slow, controlled mode. This is necessary. You have to pay conscious attention to every step of the process because you have not yet developed the automatic patterns that allow it to run on its own. When you first learned to drive, you had to think consciously about every single action, checking mirrors, adjusting the steering, operating the pedals, reading signs. It was exhausting. You could not hold a conversation while driving. You could barely think about anything else. But after hundreds of hours of practice, driving moved into System 1. It became automatic. Now you can drive while talking, while listening to music, while thinking about your day. The driving itself requires almost no conscious attention. It runs on its own. Fluent language is in System 1. For a fluent speaker, producing language is automatic, fast, and unconscious. It requires very little mental energy, which is why fluent speakers can talk while also listening, thinking, managing the social situation, noticing emotional cues, and doing all the other things that a real conversation requires. For a learner who is still in System 2 for language production, who is still consciously constructing sentences, applying grammar rules, choosing words, speaking, requires enormous mental energy. And when you add editing on top of System 2 production, you are stacking two slow, expensive processes on top of each other. It is like trying to drive with two sets of controls, one person at the wheel trying to drive, and another person also at the wheel trying to correct the driving in real time. The car jerks. It stalls. It goes off course. Not because neither driver knows how to drive, but because they are both trying to control the same vehicle at the same time. The path to fluency is the path from System 2 to System 1. You move language production from the slow, conscious system to the fast, automatic system by using the language extensively in real communicative conditions, with real stakes, real meaning, real interaction. Every time you use a pattern in a real situation, the automatic system learns it a little more. Every time you use a word in context, it becomes more accessible, more automatic. The process is slow. It takes hundreds and thousands of repetitions, but it is reliable, and it is the only way. And the key obstacle to this transition, the thing that keeps language stuck in System 2, is exactly what we have been talking about, the editing habit. Because when you edit in real time, you are constantly keeping language production in the conscious, deliberate system. You are preventing the automatic system from taking over. You are essentially telling your brain, do not use your automatic processes here. Stay conscious, stay deliberate, check everything. And so the automatic system never fully develops for speaking, even as it develops in other areas, even as you get better and better at reading English, at understanding spoken English, at writing English. Speaking stays difficult because the editing habit keeps it trapped in System 2. The relationship between System 1 and System 2 also explains something else that learners often find confusing: why their English seems better in some situations than others. You might notice that you speak much better when you are relaxed, when you are talking with close friends, when you are talking about a topic you know very well and care about deeply. And you speak much worse when you are nervous, when you are in a formal situation, when you are talking to a stranger, or an authority figure when the stakes feel high. This is because stress and nervousness activate System 2. They put your brain into deliberate, careful, monitoring mode. And in that mode, the internal editor becomes much louder, much more active, much more intrusive. The automatic language system gets suppressed. The editor takes over. And the result is worse speaking, not better, even though your intention is to be more careful and more correct. This is why so many learners say things like, "I can speak English much better when I am not thinking about speaking English. When I forget to be nervous, I suddenly speak fine. When I stop trying, the words come out more easily." This is real, and it is not a mystery. It is exactly what happens when System 1 gets a chance to operate without System 2 interference. The automatic processes do their job, and the language flows. The goal is to create that System 1 state intentionally, not just when you happen to be relaxed, but reliably, as a trained condition. And we will talk about how to do that. But first, I want to spend some time on one of the most painful manifestations of the editing habit: the fear of making mistakes. The fear of making mistakes. There is a lie that most language learners have believed for most of their learning lives. The lie is this: making a mistake is bad. You have probably never heard someone say this out loud. No one sat you down and told you directly, "Mistakes are bad, you should avoid them." But this message was communicated to you repeatedly, through years of language education, through every red mark on a test paper, through every correction in class, through every moment when you said something wrong and felt embarrassed. The message was clear, even without words. Correct English is good. Incorrect English is bad. Mistakes are failures. And this belief, this deeply internalized association between mistakes and failure, is one of the most powerful drivers of the editing habit. Because if mistakes are failures, then you need to prevent them. And the only way to prevent mistakes in real time is to check everything before you say it, which is exactly the editing habit. So the fear of mistakes and the editing habit are not separate problems. They are one problem. They are two sides of the same coin. Deal with one, and the other starts to dissolve. But to deal with the fear of mistakes, you first need to challenge the belief that drives it. You need to look honestly at what mistakes actually are, not what they feel like emotionally, but what they actually are, functionally, in real, human communication. Let us start with what happens when you make a mistake in English. You say a word wrong, or you use the wrong tense, or you choose an awkward phrase. What actually happens? In most cases, the other person understands you anyway. The mistake does not prevent communication. The human brain is extremely good at working out meaning from context, even when the language is imperfect. A native English speaker has been doing this their whole life, listening to people with different accents, different dialects, different levels of fluency, and they are very, very good at figuring out what you mean, even when the form is not perfect. A small grammatical error is almost never a communication disaster. In most cases, the other person does not even notice. This sounds impossible, but it is true. When you are in a conversation, the other person's brain is focused on meaning. They are trying to understand what you are saying, not to analyze how you are saying it. They are not running a grammar check on your sentences in real time. They are listening for the content, the message, the meaning. Small errors simply slide past their attention most of the time. And in the cases where they do notice where the error is significant enough that it catches their attention, what actually happens? Usually, they ask a clarifying question. They say, "Sorry, can you say that again?" Or they might gently correct you. And either of these responses is fine. It is not a disaster. It is a normal part of human communication. People ask for clarification all the time. People gently correct each other all the time. It is not embarrassing. It is not shameful. It is just communication being adjusted and refined in real time, which is what communication does. The fear that a mistake will make you look stupid, that it will cause people to think less of you, that it will create a terrible and permanent impression. This fear is much larger than the actual consequences of making a mistake. And recognizing this gap, the gap between the fear and the reality, is the first step to reducing the power of the fear over your speaking behavior. There is also something else to understand about mistakes, something that turns the whole idea on its head. Mistakes are not just acceptable in language learning, they are necessary. They are the mechanism by which language learning happens. When you try to produce a language pattern that you have not fully internalized yet, you will make errors. This is not a sign of failure. It is a sign that you are working at the right level, that you are attempting things that are slightly beyond your current automatic ability. And when you make those errors and notice them, or when someone else notices them, your brain gets information about the gap between your current ability and the target, and it adjusts, it learns. Not always immediately, not always consciously, but consistently over time. If you never make mistakes, if you successfully avoid all errors by only saying things you are already 100% sure about, you will never grow. You will only use the patterns you already have. You will stay in a safe, comfortable zone where you never say anything wrong, but also never say anything new, anything difficult, anything beyond what you already know. You will be linguistically frozen. The willingness to make mistakes is the willingness to grow. They are inseparable. Every great English speaker who is not a native speaker made thousands and thousands of mistakes on their path to fluency. Not in spite of their fluency, but as part of the path to their fluency. The mistakes were not obstacles they overcame. The mistakes were the road itself. When you change how you see mistakes, when you genuinely start to see them as information rather than failure, as evidence of growth rather than evidence of inadequacy, the editing habit starts to lose its justification, because the whole reason you edit is to prevent mistakes. And if mistakes are not the terrible things you thought they were, you do not need the editor quite so urgently. The editor was hired to protect you from something that is not actually as dangerous as you feared. And once you understand that, you can begin to give it a little less power. The grammar trap. Let us talk specifically about grammar, because grammar is the most common and most specific thing that the internal editor focuses on. And there are several things about English grammar and the way it is taught that make it particularly likely to trap learners in the editing cycle. The first thing to understand about English grammar is that the grammar you learned in school is a description of the language, not the language itself. Grammar rules are descriptions that linguists and educators created to explain patterns in the language. They were not created first and then used to build the language. The language came first. People spoke English for hundreds of years before anyone wrote a grammar book. The grammar book is an attempt to describe what people were already doing naturally. This matters because when you learn a grammar rule, you are learning a simplified description of a complex, context-dependent, constantly shifting phenomenon. Grammar rules always have exceptions. They always have edge cases. They always oversimplify. And the more complex and nuanced the language feature verb tenses, for example, or articles, or prepositions, the more the rules oversimplify. When you try to apply grammar rules in real time, you are trying to apply these simplified descriptions to complex, real-world situations. And very often, the situation does not fit the rule cleanly. You learned that present perfect is for experiences and past simple is for finished actions. Fine. But in real life, native speakers use both tenses in overlapping ways, and the choice between them often depends on subtle differences in meaning and emphasis that no simple rule can capture. So you try to apply the rule, it does not quite fit the situation. You get confused, you pause, you edit. The second problem with grammar-focused editing is that English grammar, in spoken conversation, is much more relaxed than written English grammar. Native speakers in natural conversation regularly violate the rules you learned in school. They use sentence fragments. They leave out subjects. They use informal contractions and ellipsis. They switch between tenses in ways that would be marked wrong on an exam. They say things like, going to the shops, you want anything? Or, no idea, to be honest, or, been there, done that. None of these are grammatically complete sentences by the standards of formal English, but they are perfectly natural, perfectly understood, perfectly normal spoken English. When you apply written grammar standards to spoken conversation, which is exactly what the editing habit tends to do, you are holding yourself to a standard that native speakers themselves do not apply in casual speech. You are trying to be more correct than the people you are trying to sound like. The third problem is one we already touched on but needs more attention. Trying to apply grammar rules in real time creates a cognitive bottleneck. Working memory, the mental space where you do real-time processing, is very limited. You can only hold a small number of things in it at once. When you are speaking, working memory needs to handle many things simultaneously. The meaning you want to express, the words to express it, the social context of the conversation, the listener's reactions, the flow of the dialogue. Adding grammar rule application to this already crowded space creates overload. Something has to give. And what usually gives is either fluency, you slow down, or freeze, or accuracy, you make more mistakes than you would have if you had not been consciously trying to apply the rules in the first place. Yes, you actually make more grammar mistakes when you try to consciously apply grammar rules while speaking than when you let your automatic language system handle it. Because the automatic system, imperfect as it may be, is much faster and more efficient than the conscious system. And when you slow down the process and create cognitive overload, errors multiply. This is deeply counterintuitive, and many learners resist it. How can trying to be correct lead to more errors? But it is real, and it is well documented. The intervention of conscious grammar monitoring under pressure makes production worse, not better. So what is the solution? The solution is to take grammar out of the speaking moment entirely and put it in the studying moment. When you are preparing to speak before a conversation, during practice, you can think about grammar. You can study a structure. You can practice it in controlled conditions. You can drill it until it feels more natural. But when you are in the actual conversation, you trust whatever automatic patterns you have built, and you do not consciously check. You let the sentence come out, you keep the flow, and if there was an error, you note it later, after the conversation, and you study that error in your next practice session. Separate the speaking from the studying. Keep them in separate compartments. Do not try to do both at once. The perfect word, trap. If grammar is the most common focus of the internal editor, then the search for the perfect word is the most emotionally painful, because the perfect word trap is not just about language. It is about something deeper, a desire for precision, for being understood exactly, for not losing anything in the translation from thought to speech. Here is how the perfect word trap works. You have a thought. You know what you want to say. You have the meaning clear in your head. But when you try to put it into words, you cannot find exactly the right word, the word that captures the full meaning, the nuance, the specific shade of what you want to communicate. You know 3 or 4 words that are somewhere in the neighborhood of what you want to say, but none of them feels exactly right. And so you pause, searching for the perfect word that does not seem to come while the conversation waits. Or you know a word that exists in your native language, a word that captures exactly what you want to say, but you cannot think of the English equivalent. The thought is perfectly clear in your first language, but it seems to have no exact translation. And rather than approximating, rather than finding a close enough word and moving on, you get stuck searching for an exact equivalent that may or may not exist. This trap is rooted in a beautiful instinct, the instinct for precision, for communicating clearly and fully. And in writing, where you have time and space to search for exactly the right word, this instinct is valuable. Great writers spend time finding exactly the right word. That precision is part of what makes writing powerful. But in conversation, this instinct becomes a liability because conversation does not work like writing. In conversation, meaning is co-constructed between speakers. You say something approximately right, the listener interprets it, adjusts for context, fills in gaps, and arrives at the meaning. The listener is doing active work to understand you. The meaning is not just in your words, it is in the whole communicative situation, the tone, the context, the relationship, the shared background, the physical situation. All of these things contribute to meaning, and they all reduce the pressure on any single word to be perfectly precise. This means that in conversation, a close enough word is usually exactly enough. A word that captures 70 or 80% of the meaning, delivered fluently and confidently, communicates far more effectively than the perfect word delivered after a 5-second pause. Because the pause itself communicates something: uncertainty, difficulty, struggle, and that communication can undermine the message even when the eventual word is perfect. The practical solution here is to develop what I call a vocabulary of approximation. This is a set of phrases and strategies you can use to express yourself even when the exact word is not available. Phrases like something like, a kind of, you know when. It is similar to, the best word I can find is, in my language we say this, but in English I think it is. These phrases do several things at once. They keep the conversation moving. They signal to the listener that you are working on precision, which most listeners appreciate and respect. And they buy you a little time to search for the word without creating an uncomfortable silence. Learning to approximate, learning to say something is roughly right rather than waiting for something exactly right, is one of the most practical and immediately useful things you can do for your fluency. It is not about lowering your standards. It is about understanding that conversation operates on a different standard than writing, and that a confidently expressed approximation serves the goals of conversation far better than a hesitantly expressed precision. And there is another thing worth saying here. The more you use language, the more you speak and read and listen, the bigger your vocabulary becomes, and the more accessible individual words become. Words that currently sit at the edge of your vocabulary, that require effort to retrieve, will eventually move toward the center. They will become automatic. The retrieval will become effortless. But this only happens if you keep speaking, keep using, keep engaging with the language. If you stop speaking because you cannot find the perfect word, the word never gets practiced, never becomes automatic, and you are stuck in the same place forever. Use approximations now. Use the words you have. Use them confidently, even if they are not perfect, and trust that your vocabulary will grow over time through use. The perfect word trap is not a vocabulary problem. It is a patience problem. Impatience with the process of acquisition. Impatience with the time it takes for automatic retrieval to develop. Give the process time. Keep speaking. The words will come. The pronunciation trap. Pronunciation is a particularly sensitive area for many English learners, and it deserves its own careful discussion. Because the pronunciation trap is not just about speaking clearly, it is tied up with identity, with self-image, with how we feel about where we come from and who we are. And when it becomes another focus of the internal editor, it can be especially paralyzing. Let me say something first that might surprise you. Your accent is not a problem. Your accent is information. It tells people where you are from, what languages have shaped your way of speaking, what your background is. Accents are a normal and entirely human feature of speech. Every person who speaks a language has an accent. Native English speakers have accents: British accents, American accents, Australian accents, Irish accents, South African accents, and within each of these, there are dozens of sub-accents. There is no single accent-free version of English. What gets called a neutral accent in broadcasting or teaching is itself an accent, just one that happens to have social prestige in certain contexts. The question with accent is not whether you have one. You will always have one. The question is whether your accent is intelligible, whether people can understand what you are saying. And intelligibility is a different thing from having a particular accent or sounding like a particular variety of English. You can have a very strong accent and still be completely intelligible. You can speak with clear, non-native phonology and still communicate perfectly well. The fear that your accent makes you hard to understand, or that it makes you sound less intelligent or less educated, this fear is almost always disproportionate to reality. Most people in the world speak English as a second or foreign language, and most of them have accents. International communication in English happens every day between people with vastly different accents, and it works. Intelligibility does not require a perfect accent. It requires clear enough pronunciation of the sounds that distinguish meaning, and it requires rhythmic and prosodic patterns that are consistent enough for the listener to follow. When the internal editor focuses on pronunciation, it usually does so in one of two ways. The first is individual sounds, words that you struggle to pronounce correctly, that come out wrong or unclear when you say them. The second is more global, a general anxiety about how you sound overall, about whether your accent is too strong, about whether you are being understood. The individual sounds problem is real, and it is worth working on, but in practice sessions, not during conversations. If there are specific sounds in English that you consistently struggle with, the TH sound, the V versus W distinction, the distinction between long and short vowels, these are things you can practice deliberately, slowly, in isolation, until they become more accurate. But during a conversation, trying to consciously adjust individual sounds in real time is almost impossible, because sound production is one of the most automatic processes in speech. By the time you consciously decide to change the way you are producing a sound, you have already produced it. The conscious monitoring comes too late. What actually improves pronunciation is extended exposure and practice, not real-time monitoring. The global accent anxiety is primarily a confidence and acceptance issue, and the work to do there is internal. It is about accepting that your accent is part of who you are. It is about recognizing that clarity and warmth and genuine engagement communicate far more in a conversation than phonetic perfection. It is about watching and listening to great communicators who have non-native accents and noticing that they are not hampered by their accents at all. Their confidence and fluency carry them forward. When you stop monitoring your pronunciation during conversations, when you let your mouth say the sounds it naturally produces, and focus instead on the meaning you are trying to communicate, something interesting often happens. Your pronunciation actually improves because you are relaxed, because the muscles of your face and mouth are not tense with anxiety, because you are focused on communication rather than performance. Relaxed, focused communication tends to produce clearer speech than nervous, self-monitored performance. The monitoring makes it worse, not better. The naturalness trap. We have talked about the grammar trap, the perfect word trap, and the pronunciation trap. Now let us talk about the fourth and most subtle form of editing, the naturalness trap. This one is particularly worth examining because it is the hardest to recognize and the hardest to escape. The naturalness trap is what happens when your internal editor is not focused on any specific rule or specific word or specific sound, but is simply asking a broader, vaguer, more pervasive question. Does this sound natural? Does this sound like real English? Does this sound like something a native speaker would say? And the reason this trap is so difficult is that the question in itself is not wrong. It is a good question. It is actually an excellent question for a language learner to be asking. Asking yourself whether your English sounds natural is a mark of high awareness. It means you have moved beyond just asking, "Is this grammatically correct?" to asking, "Does this communicate in the way real English communicates?" with the rhythm and texture and feel of genuine fluent speech. But this good question, asked in the wrong moment, becomes a trap, because in a live conversation, you cannot answer this question, not reliably, not in real time. To know whether something sounds natural, you need a reference point, a deep and extensive internal model of what natural English sounds like across many contexts and registers and speech styles. And for most learners, that model is incomplete. It has gaps. There are areas of English naturalness that you have not yet internalized, that you do not have a clear feel for. And when the editor asks, "Does this sound natural?" and the answer is, "I am not sure," the result is hesitation, revision, more hesitation, more revision. And the whole naturalness check becomes an obstacle rather than a guide. The naturalness of your English is built over time through exposure and use. You cannot check your way to naturalness. You cannot edit your way to it. You become more natural by spending enormous amounts of time in contact with natural English, listening to conversations, watching people interact, reading dialogue, engaging in conversation yourself. Over time, your ear for natural English becomes better. Your intuition for what sounds right improves. And this improved intuition gradually feeds into your automatic production, making your English more natural without you having to consciously check it. But while this process is still developing, and it is always developing, because language is always growing and changing, the naturalness trap will catch you if you let the editor ask that question while you are speaking. The solution is the same as with the other traps. Take that question out of the conversation and put it in the study session. After the conversation, you can reflect on moments that felt unnatural and explore why. You can listen to examples of how that thing is typically said. You can practice the more natural version, but during the conversation, trust what you have and let it flow. There is also something important to say about the standard you are comparing yourself to when you ask, "Does this sound natural?" Most learners are comparing themselves to some idealized version of a native speaker, the most educated, most articulate, most fluent version they can imagine. They are comparing their everyday conversational English to the best written and spoken English they have ever been exposed to. And this comparison is deeply unfair. Natural spoken English, the English that native speakers actually use in real, informal, unscripted conversation, is full of hesitations, restarts, fragments, informal constructions, contractions, ellipses, and all the other features of natural speech. It is not polished. It is not perfect. It sounds nothing like formal, written English. When you compare your spoken English to the polished standard of formal writing, you will always find it wanting. But that comparison is meaningless, because no one speaks formal written English in casual conversation. Not native speakers. Not anyone. Compare your spoken English to real spoken English. Listen to native speakers in casual conversation, not in prepared speeches, not in professional broadcasts, but in actual, informal conversation. Listen to how they actually talk. Listen to the repetitions, the unfinished sentences, the changes of direction, the informality, the imperfection. And then ask yourself, is my English really so different from this? Is the gap really as large as I imagined? In most cases, when learners do this honestly, they are surprised. The gap is smaller than they thought. And many of the things they were editing themselves for, the things their internal editor was calling unnatural, are actually completely normal features of natural spoken language. The connection between thinking and speaking. Now, I want to go deeper into something that the editing habit affects in a way that most learners do not realize. It does not just affect the language you produce. It affects your thinking. It affects what you can even think about while you are in an English conversation. This is a profound point, and I want to take the time to explain it fully. When you are fully engaged in editing your English while speaking, your cognitive bandwidth, the mental processing capacity you have available, is almost entirely consumed by the editing process. Grammar checking, vocabulary searching, pronunciation monitoring, naturalness assessing. All of this is running constantly, requiring constant attention, consuming constant mental energy. And this means there is very little bandwidth left for the thinking part of the conversation, the part where you are actually engaging with the content, the part where you are listening deeply to what the other person is saying. the part where you are forming your own views, making your own arguments, exploring your own ideas. This is why many learners say things like, "When I speak English, I feel stupid. My ideas seem so basic. I cannot have the same kinds of conversations in English that I can have in my own language. In my own language, I can talk about complex and nuanced things. But in English, I can only manage simple things." And they attribute this to their English level. They think they do not know enough English to talk about complex things. But often, the real reason is not vocabulary or grammar. The real reason is bandwidth. The editing habit is consuming so much of their available cognitive resources that there is not enough left to think clearly and deeply about the topic. The thoughts are actually there. The ideas are actually present. The intelligence and depth and nuance are all intact. But they cannot access them fully because the mental space where thinking happens is crowded out by the editing process. This is one of the saddest effects of the editing habit. It does not just make you sound less fluent, it actually makes you seem, and sometimes feel, less intelligent in your second language than you are. Not because you are less intelligent, but because intelligence in conversation requires cognitive bandwidth, and the editing habit has stolen most of your bandwidth before the thinking even begins. When you release the editing habit, when you learn to speak with less self-monitoring and more flow, you will find that your thoughts in English become deeper, richer, more interesting. Not because your English knowledge has suddenly improved, but because you have freed up the mental space to actually think. You will be able to follow the other person's argument more closely. You will be able to construct your own argument more fully. You will be able to notice nuance, respond to subtlety, engage with complexity. And you will start to feel, perhaps for the first time, that you can actually be yourself in English. That the person you are in your own language is not lost when you switch to English. This feeling of being able to be yourself in English, of being able to bring your full intelligence and personality to an English conversation, is one of the most profound rewards of working through the editing habit, and it is available to you. It is not some distant, theoretical future. It is the natural result of speaking with more freedom and less self-monitoring. But to get there, you need to understand and break the thinking-speaking loop, because the editing habit does not just steal bandwidth from thinking. It also interferes with a natural relationship between thinking and speaking in a way that creates a specific kind of confusion that many learners know well. In natural speech, thinking and speaking are not two separate sequential processes. You do not think the whole thought first and then speak it. You think and speak simultaneously in a continuous loop. You start saying something, and the act of saying it helps you discover what you think. You begin a sentence without knowing exactly where it will end, and the process of speaking it helps you find the ending. This is why real spoken language sounds different from written language, because it is genuinely produced in real time, with thinking and speaking intertwined. When you edit while speaking, you try to break this loop. You try to produce only complete, fully formed, pre-checked thoughts. You try to know what you are going to say before you say it. And this is simply not how natural speech works. It creates an unnatural tension between the thinking and the speaking, and it is part of why speaking in English can feel so stilted and disconnected from your actual thoughts. Allow the thinking and speaking to be intertwined again. Allow yourself to start a sentence without knowing where it will end. Allow yourself to discover what you think by the act of saying it. This is messy. It is imperfect. It sounds like real conversation. And it is the way human minds actually work when they are speaking freely. Why translation is a form of editing. I want to come back to translation because it deserves its own dedicated discussion. For many learners, and this is particularly true for those who speak languages that are very different from English, translation is not just something that happens sometimes. It is the fundamental mechanism through which they process English. It is the underlying architecture of their English use. And as long as translation is the underlying architecture, a certain kind of editing will always be present. Here is what I mean. When you translate, when you think in your first language, and then convert to English, you are not just doing a simple word swap. You are doing something much more complex. You are taking a thought that is structured according to the grammar, vocabulary, logic, and cultural assumptions of your first language, and you are converting it into a different structure, the structure of English. And these two structures are often very different. The word order may be different. The way time is expressed may be different. The way relationships between ideas are shown grammatically may be different. The specific connotations and cultural weight of words may be different. So translation requires you to not just find English words for your thoughts, but to restructure the thoughts themselves. And this restructuring is a form of editing. You are taking the original thought and modifying it to fit the target language. Every time you translate, you are comparing the original to the translation, checking whether the translation preserves the meaning, adjusting when it does not. This is, by definition, an editing process, and it is a slow process. It requires attention and effort. It produces exactly the kind of delay and hesitation and freezing that we have been talking about. The path away from translation is not to think less that would be impossible and undesirable. The path is to build a system of English patterns that is directly connected to meaning, without going through the first language as an intermediary. This is what linguists call thinking in English. And it is not some mystical achievement reserved for the most advanced learners. It is a practical skill that develops gradually as you spend more time using English in real communicative situations. When you first start to think in English, it happens in small pieces. You notice that you do not need to translate a short phrase, it comes directly. You reach for a simple thought, and the English just appears, without going through your first language. These moments are the beginning of direct processing. And over time, as you keep using the language, the domain of direct processing expands. More thoughts come in English, more patterns activate directly, less translation is needed. But this only happens if you practice in a way that encourages direct processing. And the biggest barrier to developing direct processing is the translation habit itself. Because every time you default to thinking in your first language and then translating, you are reinforcing the translation pathway and making the direct pathway weaker. Every time you allow yourself to express a thought in English without first having it fully formed in your first language, you are building the direct pathway. This is why immersion, extended periods of time when you are surrounded by English and engaging with it, is so powerful. Not because you learn new grammar rules in immersion, but because immersion forces you to develop direct processing. When you are immersed, you cannot always stop to translate. The situation demands response too quickly. And so, your brain is pushed to develop the direct pathways out of necessity. You do not need to travel abroad to create immersive conditions. You can create them for yourself by changing how you engage with English. Read in English, not as a translation exercise, but for the content. Watch English content without pausing to translate every word. Have conversations in English and commit to expressing yourself directly, even if imperfectly, without going back to your first language as a reference point. Think in English about everyday things, your plans, your observations, your reactions. Even if these thoughts are simple, even if they feel broken and incomplete, the practice is building direct connections between thoughts and English words, bypassing the translation layer. The translation habit is deeply comfortable because it is familiar and it feels safe. It feels like you are being precise, like you are controlling the meaning, like you are preventing misunderstanding. But it is actually a major source of the slowness and difficulty you experience in speaking. And reducing it, not all at once, not immediately, but gradually, deliberately, will produce one of the most significant improvements in your speaking fluency that you can make. How editing affects listening too. We have been talking mostly about how the editing habit affects speaking, but I want to spend some time on something that often gets overlooked. The editing habit also significantly damages your listening. And since listening is half of every conversation, damage to your listening is damage to your overall communicative ability. Here is how this works. When you are in a conversation and you are heavily editing your own speech, most of your mental attention is turned inward. It is focused on your own language production, on the checking and correcting and monitoring that is constantly running. This means there is very little attention left to focus outward on what the other person is saying. The result is that you miss things, not because you are not interested, not because your English comprehension is poor, but because your attention is directed at the wrong place. You are so busy monitoring your own output that you cannot fully process the incoming input. This creates a specific kind of conversational problem. You are half listening, you hear the words, but you are not processing them fully. You are catching the main ideas, but missing the nuances. You are following the general direction of the conversation, but not tracking the specific details. And this partial listening has real consequences. One consequence is that you respond to what you expected the person to say rather than what they actually said. Because you were only half listening, you filled in the gaps with your own assumptions. And your response reflects those assumptions rather than the actual content of what was said. This is confusing for the other person, who may wonder whether you understood them, and it often leads to misunderstandings that are then difficult to trace back to their source. Another consequence is that you miss opportunities to respond in ways that build the conversation. You miss interesting things the other person said that you could engage with, questions you could ask, connections you could make. And the conversation stays superficial, stays generic, never goes anywhere particularly interesting. And this feels like an English problem, like you just do not have the vocabulary or the knowledge to have a deeper conversation. But actually, it is often an attention problem. If your attention was freed from the editing process, you would notice much more, engage much more richly, and have much more interesting conversations. There is also a third and very subtle consequence. When you are a poor listener because of your attention being absorbed by editing, the other person senses it, not consciously in most cases, but intuitively. Human beings are very sensitive to whether the person they are talking to is truly present and engaged. When someone is genuinely listening, when their full attention is on you, you feel it. The conversation has a warmth and a quality of connection. And when someone is not fully present, when their attention is somewhere else, you feel that too. There is a flatness to the interaction, a sense that they are not really with you. When you are editing heavily while speaking, you are not really fully present in the conversation. You are partly elsewhere, inside your own head, managing the editing process. And the other person will feel this absence, even if they cannot name it. And it will affect the quality of the connection, the warmth of the exchange, the sense of genuine mutual engagement that makes a conversation worth having. Releasing the editing habit does not just help your speaking. It frees your attention to be genuinely present in the conversation, to listen deeply, to respond richly, to build connection. And this is one of the most transformative effects of the change, because it turns English not just into a functional communication tool, but into a vehicle for real human connection. The role of anxiety in the editing cycle. We touched on fear and anxiety earlier, but I want to examine it more carefully now because anxiety plays a particularly complex and important role in the editing cycle. It is not just a consequence of editing. It is also a cause. And understanding the relationship between anxiety and editing is crucial for breaking the cycle. Here is the basic cycle. You feel anxious about speaking English? This anxiety activates more vigilant monitoring. Your brain goes into a heightened state of self-checking because it perceives a threat and it wants to prevent failure. This heightened monitoring produces more editing. The editing breaks your flow and produces more errors and more hesitation. These errors and hesitations confirm your anxiety. See, you are right to be worried. Your English is not good enough. And the confirmed anxiety produces even more vigilance, even more monitoring, even more editing. And so the cycle continues, spinning faster and tighter with every turn. This is a vicious cycle in the true technical sense. Each element feeds the next, creating a self-reinforcing loop that can be extremely difficult to interrupt once it is in motion. The anxiety in this cycle is real. It is not irrational. It is not unfounded. It is a genuine response to a situation that your brain has learned to perceive as threatening. Speaking in a second language involves real risks. The risk of being misunderstood, the risk of looking foolish, the risk of social awkwardness, the risk of being judged. Your brain has learned that these risks are present in English-speaking situations, and so it activates anxiety responses whenever you are in those situations. This is completely normal. This is how threat response systems work. But the anxiety response, designed to protect you, ends up making the situation worse. The heightened monitoring it produces the editing does not actually reduce the risks you are afraid of. It does not make you sound better, as we have established. It makes you sound worse. So the protection mechanism is not actually protecting you. It is creating the outcome it was designed to prevent. Breaking the anxiety editing cycle requires working at both ends. You need to work on reducing the anxiety itself, building a more accurate and less threatening model of what speaking English involves, what the consequences of mistakes really are, what other people are actually noticing and judging. And you need to work on reducing the editing behavior directly, even before the anxiety is fully resolved, by practicing speaking without editing in low-stakes situations where the anxiety is manageable. The key concept for managing speaking anxiety is graduated exposure. This is a well-established principle from psychology. If you want to reduce your fear of something, you expose yourself to it repeatedly in conditions that are challenging enough to be growth-producing, but not so overwhelming that they activate full panic. You start in low-stakes situations, talking to yourself, practicing with a very trusted friend, recording yourself, and gradually move to higher stakes situations as your comfort and confidence grow. The reason this works is that each successful low-stakes experience provides counter-evidence to the brain's threat model. Your brain says, English speaking is dangerous. And each time you speak English and survive, each time you say something imperfect and nothing terrible happens, the brain updates its threat assessment very slightly, a small downgrade in the danger level. And over time, with enough experiences, the threat model adjusts significantly. The anxiety level drops. The editing drops with it. There is also a body-level component to anxiety management that is worth mentioning. Anxiety has physical manifestations: increased heart rate, shallow breathing, muscle tension, a feeling of constriction in the chest and throat. And these physical manifestations directly affect your speech production. Shallow breathing reduces the air support for your voice, making it quieter and less confident. Muscle tension in the throat and jaw affects the quality of the sounds you produce. The physical symptoms of anxiety make you harder to understand and sound less confident, which feeds back into the anxiety itself. Learning to manage these physical aspects of anxiety through slow, deep breathing, through deliberate physical relaxation before speaking, through attention to posture and physical groundedness, can have a direct and surprisingly fast effect on speech quality. When your body is more relaxed, your voice is more relaxed. And a more relaxed voice sounds more confident and is easier to understand, which begins to interrupt the anxiety cycle. The confidence cycle. There is a common misconception about confidence and speaking. Most people believe that confidence comes first, and then speaking ability follows. That you need to feel confident before you can speak well. That if you just had more confidence, your English would suddenly flow. This is actually backwards. And believing this backwards version of the relationship keeps many learners stuck for years. Confidence in speaking, real confidence, the kind that is stable and not dependent on having a perfect day or the right mood, does not come before good speaking. It comes from good speaking. It is built by experience. It is built by speaking and discovering that you can communicate effectively, even imperfectly. It is built by having conversations and getting to the end of them and realizing that worked. I said what I wanted to say. The person understood me. The conversation was okay. I survived. Each one of these experiences deposits a small amount of confidence into your speaking account. And over time, with enough experiences, the account grows large enough to sustain you through the more difficult situations, the formal occasions, the high-stakes conversations, the moments when the anxiety spikes. But you cannot build these experiences if you are waiting for confidence to arrive first. You have to speak first. And when you speak, you will be imperfect, because speaking without having built confidence yet is inherently imperfect, and you have to allow that imperfection without letting it destroy the experience. Because every imperfect experience where you kept going, where you finished the sentence, where you stayed in the conversation that is a deposit in the confidence account, the editing habit disrupts this cycle in a very specific way. When you edit heavily while speaking, and the result is hesitant, broken, anxious-sounding speech, you walk away from the experience with a negative deposit. The experience confirms your lack of confidence rather than building it. You think, I spoke English and it was terrible. I was slow and confused, and I made mistakes. This confirms that my English is bad, and the account is overdrawn a little further. But when you speak with less editing, when you let the language flow, accept the imperfections, stay in the conversation, and get to the end, the experience is different. Even if your English was not perfect, even if there were errors, the experience has a different quality. It was alive. It had momentum. You communicated. And even if you cannot quite name what was different, you walk away feeling slightly more capable than before, slightly more like a speaker, and slightly less like a learner pretending to speak. This is the positive version of the cycle. Speaking freely, even imperfectly, creates experiences that build confidence. Growing confidence reduces anxiety. Reduced anxiety reduces editing. Reduced editing allows more fluent speech. More fluent speech creates better experiences. Better experiences build more confidence, and so on. Your job is to get this positive cycle started, even in small ways, even in low-stakes situations. And every time you speak without editing or with less editing than usual, you are making a deposit in the right account. What happens when you stop editing? I want to paint a picture of what it actually feels and sounds like when you begin to speak without the editing habit fully in charge. Because I think one reason people resist releasing the editor is that they cannot quite imagine what the alternative looks like. They imagine it will be chaos, a stream of random, incorrect, embarrassing words. And this fear of what might come out without the editor keeps the editor in place. But that is not what happens. Here is what actually happens. When you begin to reduce the editing not all at once, not perfectly, but gradually, the first thing you notice is that there is a little more space, a little more breathing room. The constant pressure of the monitoring eases slightly, and in that space, words come more readily. They feel more available. The reaching and searching and checking and correcting gets quieter. And the language that comes out is, yes, imperfect. There are errors. There are approximate words. There are sentences that trail off and restart, but it is alive. It has energy. It has the quality of real communication rather than performed correctness. The other person notices this change too, even if they cannot explain it. They sense that you are more present, more engaged, more genuinely communicating. The conversation becomes warmer. It becomes more natural. It starts to feel less like an exercise in language performance and more like an actual exchange between two people. You will make mistakes when you edit less. This is guaranteed. Some of the things your editor was catching will get through. Sentences will come out with grammatical errors. Words will be used slightly wrong. Sounds will be pronounced imperfectly. And here is the important thing. Mostly, none of this will matter. The conversation will continue. The meaning will be understood. The relationship will be maintained. And you will have learned something valuable. You will have learned that mistakes are survivable, that imperfect speech is acceptable, that communication is more robust than you thought. Over time, as you practice speaking without the heavy editing, something interesting happens to your accuracy. It gets better. Not immediately, not in a straight line, but better overall. Because you are speaking more. And every moment of speaking is practice. Because you are using patterns in real communication. And those patterns are getting internalized. Because you are building the automatic language system that produces fluent, accurate language without conscious checking. The accuracy comes, but it comes through practice and automatization, through the system that is built in System 1, not through the conscious checking of System 2. Your sentences become longer. This is one of the most noticeable changes. When people edit heavily, they tend to produce very short, simple sentences. Sentences that are small enough to be checked quickly. But when you start speaking more freely, you discover that you have the language to say more complex things, that you can produce longer, more developed ideas, that you can build an argument or tell a story with multiple parts. The sentence length and complexity naturally expand when the editing pressure is removed. Your speaking speed increases too, but in a natural, comfortable way. Not the kind of speed that comes from rushing nervously, but the kind that comes from language flowing more easily. You sound more like a person who is thinking and talking at the same time, because you actually are. And perhaps most valuably of all, you find yourself saying new things, things you have never said before in English, things that are at the edge of your current ability. Because you are taking risks that the editor would never have allowed. You are reaching for words that you are not 100% sure about. You are constructing sentences in real time without checking them first. And some of these risks fail. The word is wrong. The sentence goes somewhere unexpected, but some of them succeed. And every successful risk is a new pattern added to your system. A new capability integrated. A new piece of English that is now yours. This is what growth in language looks like. Not the slow, careful accumulation of verified knowledge, but the fast, messy, risky exploration of the edges of what you can do. The editing habit keeps you in the safe center. Releasing the editing habit lets you explore the edges, and the edges are where the growth is. How to retrain your brain. Now we get to the practical part. We have spent a lot of time understanding the problem, and this understanding is genuinely important. It is not just background. The depth of your understanding of the editing habit will directly affect how effectively you can address it. But now, let us talk about what you actually do. What are the concrete, specific things you can practice to retrain your brain and reduce the power of the internal editor? I want to give you real strategies, not motivational advice, not vague suggestions, to just be more confident. Real things you can do, starting today, that will produce measurable changes in your speaking over time. The speaking flow practice. The first and most fundamental practice is what I call the speaking flow practice. This is simple in concept and powerful in effect, but it requires you to commit to the discomfort of doing it. Here is the practice. Every day, set a timer for 3 to 5 minutes. Speak continuously in English for the entire duration. You can talk about anything, what you did today, what you are thinking about, a story you want to tell, an opinion you have, a description of what you see around you. The topic does not matter. The rule is this: you cannot stop, no matter what. If you cannot find the right word, you keep talking. If you lose track of your sentence, you keep talking. If you make a mistake, you keep talking. If what you are saying sounds broken or wrong or unclear, you keep talking. Your only job is to keep producing English for the full duration of the timer. Why does this work? Because it forces you to develop flow strategies, the strategies you use when the perfect word is not available, when the grammar is not certain, when the editor wants to freeze. You learn to approximate. You learn to go around obstacles rather than stopping for them. You learn to use placeholder phrases like, basically, something like that keep the language moving while your brain catches up. You learn that you can keep going even when things are not perfect. And this is enormously valuable because this is exactly the skill you need in real conversations. At first, this practice will feel terrible. 3 minutes of continuous speaking will seem like an eternity. You will run out of things to say after 30 seconds. You will make obvious errors and hear them and want to stop and correct them. You will feel embarrassed even though no one is listening. All of this is normal and expected. Stay in it. Keep talking. The discomfort is the practice. Over time, and it does not take as long as you might think, the flow will start to come. You will notice that you are getting better at keeping the language moving, that you are finding workarounds for missing words, that you are less disturbed by errors, that the 3 minutes feels less impossibly long. And these gains in your solo practice will start to transfer to real conversations. The 30% rule. The second strategy is what I call the 30% rule. This is a mindset shift as much as a technique. The rule is this: in your next English conversation, give your internal editor 30% less power than usual. Not zero. Do not try to shut it off completely, because that will either be impossible or will make you so anxious that you cannot function. Just 30% less. Concretely, this means when you feel the editor starting to check something and you feel the familiar hesitation coming, let 30% of the sentences go without checking. Choose which ones. When you have a thought and the editor says, wait, check this first sometimes. Sometimes, just speak the thought. Let it out without checking. The 30% is small enough to feel manageable. It is not asking you to abandon everything. It is just asking you to take slightly more risk than usual. And the experience of speaking those unchecked sentences and seeing that the world does not end, that is the data you need. That is the evidence that starts to reshape your threat model and lower the anxiety. Gradually, over weeks and months, increase the percentage. 40% unchecked, then 50, then 60. Not all at once, incrementally, as your experience and confidence grow. This is the graduated exposure principle in practice, the response-focused technique. The third strategy is the response-focused technique. This is specifically for conversations. In a conversation, your attention can be either inward-focused on your own language production or outward-focused on the other person and what they are saying. The editing habit pulls attention strongly inward. This technique deliberately redirects it outward. Here is how to use it. In your next English conversation, make it your primary goal to respond to the other person as specifically and as accurately as possible. Not linguistically accurately, respond to the actual content of what they said. Notice the specific details of their message. Reference them. Ask a question about them. Build on them. Your job is to be a deep listener and a genuine responder. When you focus your attention outward like this, two things happen. First, the inward monitoring naturally reduces because your attention has been redirected, and there is simply less capacity available for the editing process. Second, the quality of your engagement improves dramatically, and when you are genuinely engaged, when you are genuinely interested, language tends to flow more freely. Genuine engagement has a way of making the editor go quiet without you having to fight it directly. This is not a trick. It is a reorientation of what conversation is for. Conversation is not a language performance test. It is a connection between two people. When you remember this, when you remember that the purpose of the conversation is to actually connect with the other person, not to produce perfect English, the whole thing becomes more natural and less threatening. The mistake journal. The fourth strategy is the mistake journal, and it is perhaps the most important for long-term growth. After each English conversation or speaking session, take a few minutes to write down any errors you noticed. Not to beat yourself up about them, but to study them. Look at the error. Think about why you made it. think about the correct version. Say the correct version a few times. If it was a recurring error, something you have made many times, spend some deliberate practice time on that specific structure or word. The mistake journal does two things. First, it gives the errors somewhere to go. When you know you will review errors after the conversation, you do not need to correct them during the conversation. The editor can stand down not because the errors do not matter, but because they will be addressed later, in the right time and place. Second, it turns every conversation into a learning tool. Every conversation gives you specific, personalized data about the gaps in your English. Not the generic gaps that a textbook assumes you have, but the specific gaps that actually show up in your actual speech. This is extremely high-quality data for improvement, and it is completely free. You generate it every time you speak. Over time, the mistake journal creates a feedback loop where speaking generates data. Data informs study. Study improves automatic language patterns, and improved patterns produce better speaking. This is the loop that most learners are missing. They study without connecting the study to actual speaking, and they speak without connecting the speaking back to study. The mistake journal is the bridge between the two. The slow speed practice. The fifth strategy is the slow speed practice. This is for people who feel that when they try to reduce editing, they just rush, they speed up nervously, and the language becomes unclear. Slowing down is a way of creating space without editing. Here is what I mean. Most people think they need to speak at a certain speed to sound fluent. They think that slowness is a sign of poor English, but this is wrong. Many excellent communicators speak relatively slowly. They take their time. They pause deliberately. They do not rush. Practice speaking slowly and deliberately, but without editing. The combination slow but unedited sounds very different from slow because of editing. Slow and unedited sounds measured, confident, thoughtful. Slow because of editing sounds hesitant, uncertain, struggling. To practice this, record yourself speaking slowly and unedited on a topic. Then listen back. Notice how it sounds. Notice that the slowness does not make you sound incompetent. It makes you sound considered. It gives you the space to find words without freezing. It gives the listener more time to process your meaning. And it reduces the panic feeling that comes when you feel you have to keep up with a certain speed or you will fail. The immersion reset. The sixth strategy is what I call the immersion reset. This is about changing the environment you are in when you practice English, not just the technique. One of the most powerful things you can do to reduce the editing habit is to spend extended periods in contact with natural spoken English, not studying it, not analyzing it, just being in it. Watch English content that you genuinely find interesting and engaging. Listen to English podcasts on topics you care about. Read English books or articles in areas that excite you. Spend time with English media, not as a learner trying to extract knowledge, but as a person simply living in the language. When you do this, two things happen. Your ear for natural English improves. You develop a better intuitive sense of how English actually sounds, which gradually replaces the idealized, overly formal standard you have been comparing yourself to. And you absorb patterns, chunks, phrases, collocations, expressions that go directly into your automatic language system, bypassing the need for conscious rule application. The immersion reset is not about intensity. It is about regularity and genuineness. A little bit of genuine, enjoyable engagement with English every day is worth more than occasional forced study sessions. Make English a part of your daily life, something you do because you want to, because you are interested, because you find the content valuable or entertaining, and the language will grow in ways that deliberate study alone cannot produce. The conversation challenge. The seventh and most advanced strategy is the conversation challenge. This is for when you feel ready to take the practice into real interaction. The challenge is simple in description. Have at least one English conversation per day in which your conscious goal is fluency rather than accuracy, not a conversation where you are studying, not a conversation where you are performing for someone's evaluation. A real conversation where your goal is to communicate naturally, to keep the flow, to be present with the other person, and to not stop and check yourself every time the editor speaks up. This can be a language exchange with another learner. It can be a conversation with a native speaker. It can be an online conversation in an English-speaking community. It can be a conversation with a friend who also speaks English. The specific context matters less than the commitment to the goal. Fluency over accuracy, flow over perfection. And after each of these conversations, before you do anything else, take 30 seconds to notice what went right, what flowed, where did you stay in the conversation, when did the language come naturally. This is not toxic positivity, this is accurate data collection. The positive moments are as informative as the negative ones. And most learners are so focused on what went wrong that they miss all the evidence of what went right, which means they are not building an accurate picture of their actual abilities. The mindset shift. I want to spend some time on the deeper mindset change that underpins all of these strategies, because techniques without the right mindset will not get you far. You can do all the practices I described, but if your underlying beliefs about English speaking have not changed, the editor will keep reasserting itself. The fundamental mindset shift is this: you need to change your definition of what good English speaking is. Right now, for most learners, good English speaking means correct English. It means using the right grammar, the right words, the right pronunciation. It means not making mistakes. It means sounding as close to a native speaker as possible. This definition is the source of the editing habit. Because if good speaking is correct speaking, then editing, checking for correctness is exactly what you should be doing. The habit makes perfect sense given the definition. But this definition is wrong. Not slightly wrong, fundamentally wrong. And when you replace it with a better definition, the whole picture changes. Good English speaking means effective communication. It means getting your meaning across. It means the other person understands you. It means the conversation moves forward. It means you are present and engaged and genuine. Correctness is one factor in effectiveness, but it is not the most important factor. Not even close. Clarity, flow, engagement, and genuine meaning are all more important than grammatical correctness. And many of these things are actually damaged by over-attention to correctness. Think about the conversations you've had in any language that you remember most positively. The ones that felt real, that mattered, that connected you to another person. Were they conversations where every sentence was grammatically perfect? Almost certainly not. They were conversations where both people were genuinely present, where the communication was real, where meaning was being exchanged, not just language, where something human was happening. That is the standard for good speaking, not correctness. Connection, not accuracy. Reality, not perfection. Presence. When you adopt this standard, when you genuinely internalize it and not just say it while still secretly valuing correctness above all else, the editing habit starts to lose its power. Because the editor was employed to enforce the correctness standard, when the correctness standard is no longer the highest value, the editor's job becomes less urgent. There is another mindset shift that is equally important, and it is about your identity as a speaker. Many learners think of themselves as English learners, people who are learning the language, who are not yet complete, who are working toward some future point when they will be done, and then they will be real English speakers. This identity, the identity of a learner rather than a speaker, creates a kind of permanent, provisional status. It means that right now, in the present, your English is not fully legitimate. It is practice. It is imperfect. It is on the way to something better. This identity supports the editing habit perfectly. If you are just a learner, of course you should be checking everything. Of course you should be hesitant. Of course, you should defer to the rules and to the standard and to the judgment of more fluent speakers. You are learning. You are not there yet. The shift I am asking you to make is to identify as a speaker, right now, today. Not a perfect speaker, not a native speaker, not an expert speaker, but a speaker. Someone who uses English to communicate, who has things to say in English, whose English imperfect, growing, still developing is legitimate right now, in this moment, as a vehicle for real human communication. This is not false pride. It is not pretending to be better than you are. It is simply changing your relationship to the language you already have. The English you have, right now, is enough to communicate with. It is enough to connect with people. It is enough to express your ideas, your questions, your personality, your humanity. It is imperfect, and it is enough. When you start to live in this identity, when you start to act like a speaker rather than a learner, your speaking changes. The editor has less authority. The risk of mistakes feels more acceptable. The drive to connect becomes stronger than the drive to be correct, and the language starts to flow. The long game. Before we come to the close of this, I want to say something about time, because changing a deeply ingrained habit, one that has been reinforced over years of language education and social experience, takes time, more time than most people want to give it. And in the world of language learning content, where everyone wants quick results and transformations, this truth sometimes gets lost. The editing habit will not disappear after one practice session, or after 1 week of practicing differently, or even after 1 month. It is built deep. Its roots go down into your fear, your identity, your educational history, your sense of self. Changing it is not like learning a new grammar rule. It is more like changing a personality trait, slow, non-linear, requiring patience and persistence, and a genuine tolerance for the discomfort of being in the middle of change. But I want you to understand something about the nature of this kind of change. It does not feel gradual from the inside. What you will experience is not a steady, incremental improvement where each day is slightly better than the last. What you will experience is long periods where things feel about the same, where you seem to be making no progress, where the editor is still loud, and the flow is still elusive, and the frustration is still real. And then, sometimes without warning, something shifts. A conversation goes noticeably better than usual. A sentence comes out cleanly that you would have stumbled over before. You catch yourself speaking English and realize you were not monitoring. The automatic system was running, and you did not stop it. These moments are the sign of genuine change. They feel sudden, but they were built by all the invisible practice that seemed to produce nothing. The brain was changing the whole time. The automatic patterns were developing. The threat model was updating. The editor was getting quieter, even when you could not feel it getting quieter. And then, one day, you can. Trust the process. Do the work. Keep speaking. Keep practicing. Keep making mistakes. Keep allowing flow. And have patience with yourself, deep, real patience. The kind that does not demand results on a schedule but simply keeps showing up. There will be bad days. Days when the editor is loud and everything feels impossible and your English seems to have gotten worse rather than better. These days are normal. They are not reversals. They are the normal variability of a system that is in the process of change. Do not let a bad day convince you that the process is not working. Do not go back to the old strategy of more checking, more monitoring, more control. Stay the course. And on the good days, the days when language flows a little easier, when a conversation goes better than expected, when you hear yourself say something naturally and effortlessly that would have required long deliberation before, notice these moments. Celebrate them quietly in your own heart. Let them be evidence. Let them build the confidence account. Let them tell you what is possible. Because this is the truth about your English speaking. What is possible for you is much more than what is probable right now, given your current habits and patterns. Your capability exceeds your current performance. The gap between what you can do and what you are doing is not a gap of knowledge or grammar or vocabulary. It is a gap created by the editing habit, by the self-monitoring, the checking, the correcting, the fear. Close that gap, even partially, and the English you are capable of will begin to emerge. You already know more than you think you know. You already have more language than you realize. The words are there. The patterns are there. The capacity for communication is there. What has been in the way is the editor. And now you understand the editor. You know where it came from. You know what it is doing. You know why it is there. You know what it costs you. And you know how to begin, gradually, patiently, bravely, to give it a little less power. That is the beginning of the speaking reset. What to do right now. Do not let this end as a video you watched and found interesting and then forgot. Let it be the beginning of something different. So I want to give you one specific thing to do right now, today, before this video fades into memory. Set a timer for 3 minutes, right now, after you finish this video, and speak. Speak in English, out loud, about anything, what you are thinking about, what you want to do tomorrow. A story from your past, a place you love, anything. And for those 3 minutes, your only job is to keep talking. Do not stop. Do not edit. Do not check. Just speak. Notice what happens. Notice the editor's voice. Notice the impulse to stop and correct. Notice the discomfort of keeping the language moving when you are not sure it is right. And keep talking anyway. That 3 minutes is the first practice session. It is the first tiny step in a new direction. It is the beginning of training your brain to speak differently. It is not nothing. It matters. Do it again tomorrow, and the day after, and slowly, over time, the different direction you are moving in will become a new path, and the new path will take you somewhere your editing habit never could. You are a speaker. Speak. Everything we have talked about in this video comes down to one thing: the courage to be imperfect in real time. That is what fluency actually requires. Not perfect knowledge, not perfect grammar, not a perfect accent. The courage to let language come out of you without stopping it, without checking it, without demanding it be better before it is allowed to exist. The editing habit is, at its heart, a refusal of imperfection. It is the belief that your imperfect English is not good enough to be spoken, that it needs to be corrected, improved, refined before it can be used. And this belief, however understandable, however well-intentioned, however deeply rooted in your educational history, is the one thing standing between you and the fluency you are looking for. Let go of that belief, not all at once. Let go of a little of it today, and a little more tomorrow, and keep letting go, gradually, as the evidence accumulates that your imperfect English is enough, that people understand you, that conversations work, that connection happens, that you can communicate genuinely and meaningfully with the English you already have. The path to better English is not through more editing. It is through more speaking, more flow, more courage, more presence, more willingness to be heard as you are, right now, in this stage of your journey. That is the speaking reset. Not a reset to zero, a reset to real, a return to the natural, flowing, imperfect, genuinely communicative way that all human language was always meant to work. Thank you for being here for all of it. Now go speak.